Yeah, and as I say, Jim's wife, Julie, she's such a spectacular lady, and I just feel so...
If you know anything about Hollywood royalty, you know Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio stand at the very top as one of the most iconic pairings in movie history. Ever since starring together in Titanic and Revolutionary Road, fans spent decades watching their undeniable bond through red carpet reunions, endless romance rumors, and a shared history that outlasted most marriages. For nearly 30 years, people secretly hoped there was a hidden love story behind the scenes. But now, at 50, Kate Winslet finally broke her silence to reveal her true feelings about Leo, and her honest admission left the entertainment world completely off guard. So, what did Kate Winslet actually confess about her connection with Leonardo DiCaprio after all these years? Let's dive in. How Kate Winslet went from a struggling family to Hollywood royalty. Long before Kate Winslet became the woman millions of people knew as Rose from Titanic, she was a young girl growing up in Reading, England, in a family where acting was less about glamour and more about survival. Born on October 5, 1975, Kate was raised by Sally Ann and Roger John Winslet, with two sisters and a younger brother in a household where money was often tight. Her father was an actor who took laboring jobs whenever acting work was not enough to support the family, while her mother worked as a nanny and waitress. Acting, however, was already in Kate's blood. Her maternal grandparents were actors who ran the Reading Repertory Theater Company, so the stage was never some distant dream in her household. It was simply part of everyday life. And without knowing it then, that little girl was already taking her first steps toward a career that would eventually change everything. Kate's childhood was not exactly the glamorous beginning people might imagine when they look at the career she eventually built. Her family struggled financially, and things became even harder when her father suffered a serious foot injury in a boating accident when Kate was 10, making it more difficult for him to work. Yet despite the difficulties, Kate has remembered her childhood as one filled with love and support, and that family environment gave her something far more important than money. It gave her the confidence to keep performing. She started appearing in school productions and local youth theater shows while her sisters were also drawn toward acting. By the age of 5, Kate had already appeared on stage as Mary in a school nativity play. She was young, but there was something about performing that seemed to pull her toward it, even when the people around her did not yet know where that path would lead. But while Kate was finding her voice on stage, she was also dealing with something that could have easily crushed her confidence. At school, she was bullied by other children because of her appearance, and those experiences followed her into the early years of her acting journey. What mattered, though, was that she refused to let those voices decide what she could become. At 11, she enrolled at Red Roof's theater school in Maidenhead, where students were given opportunities to audition for professional work in London. Suddenly, the dream that had existed inside school plays began to feel a little more real. Kate appeared in commercials, worked on voice projects, and performed constantly with local theater groups. She took on roles in productions such as Annie, The Jungle Book, and Peter Pan, often without being given the biggest parts. Still, she kept showing up, and that persistence would soon become one of the defining traits of her career. Then, just as Kate was beginning to take acting seriously, reality forced her to grow up quickly. After completing her GCSE examinations in 1991, she landed her first major screen opportunity in the BBC science fiction series Dark Season. It was not the kind of role that suddenly made her famous, and the money she earned was nowhere near enough to support her dreams. Eventually, financial pressure forced her to leave Red Roof's theater school at 16. Instead of giving up on acting, she found work at a delicatessen while continuing to pursue auditions. Think about that for a moment. The future star of Titanic was not walking around Hollywood surrounded by agents and producers. She was a teenager working a regular job and trying to find her way into an industry that could just as easily have ignored her. Then came a role that would finally make people pay attention. In 1994, Kate auditioned for Peter Jackson's Heavenly Creatures, competing against around 175 other young women for the part of Juliet Hume. She won the role because of the intensity she brought into the audition, and the experience pushed her into territory far beyond what she had done before. The film was based on a real and disturbing 1954 murder case, and Kate immersed herself deeply in the character, studying trial transcripts, letters, diaries, and information connected to the real people involved. Filming at the actual locations made the experience even more emotionally demanding, and she later recalled finding it difficult to separate herself from the character once she went home. But there was another side to it. Critics noticed her. For the first time, Kate Winslet was no longer simply a promising young actress. She was beginning to look like someone Hollywood needed to watch. That breakthrough quickly opened another door, and this time it came through one of the most respected names in British cinema. While promoting Heavenly Creatures in Los Angeles, Kate auditioned for what was initially a much smaller role in Sense and Sensibility. Emma Thompson was so impressed by her audition that Kate was ultimately given the much larger part of Marianne Dashwood. The role required her to show a completely different side of herself, and director Ang Lee pushed her to develop more restraint and elegance in her performance. Kate embraced the challenge, and the result was impossible to ignore. Her performance earned her a BAFTA and a Screen Actors Guild Award, along with an Academy Award nomination. Suddenly, the girl who had once struggled to get leading roles on local stages was being recognized alongside some of the biggest names in the industry. Then came 1997, and everything changed in a way Kate Winslet could never have predicted. When James Cameron began casting Titanic, Kate desperately wanted the role of Rose DeWitt Bukater. Cameron initially considered other actresses, but Kate refused to disappear quietly into the crowd. She pushed for the opportunity and eventually convinced him that she was Rose. Across from her was Leonardo DiCaprio, who would play Jack, and together they created a screen partnership that would become one of the most recognizable in movie history. But getting there was anything but easy. The production was enormous, physically demanding and exhausting, with long hours and difficult filming conditions. Kate endured injuries, illness, and exhaustion during production, yet she stayed committed to the performance. And when Titanic finally reached audiences, the reaction was unlike anything she had experienced before. The film became a worldwide phenomenon, earning more than $2 billion and winning 11 Academy Awards, while Kate received her first Best Actress Oscar nomination at just 22. Overnight, she had gone from a young British actress still figuring out where she belonged to one of the biggest stars on the planet. Yet what happened next says almost as much about Kate as Titanic itself. Instead of immediately chasing enormous blockbusters and the biggest possible paychecks, she deliberately moved toward smaller independent productions because she believed she still had more to learn. She had reached Hollywood royalty, but she did not seem interested in behaving like royalty. And perhaps that was exactly what separated Kate Winslet from so many stars who rose alongside her. She had already learned something long before the world knew her name. Fame could open a door, but staying true to yourself was what kept you standing once you walked through it. The real story behind Kate and Leo's Titanic casting. For almost 3 decades, Titanic has remained one of those rare movies that somehow refuses to disappear. People still talk about Jack and Rose, still debate the ending, and still remember the moment Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio first appeared together on that enormous ship. But behind the romance that audiences eventually fell in love with was a casting process that could have turned out very differently. James Cameron has revealed that he initially had serious doubts about both actors, meaning the two people we now cannot imagine Titanic without were not even guaranteed to be there in the first place. And while Kate Winslet eventually became inseparable from the role of Rose, her sudden rise to fame came with a price she was nowhere near prepared for. Because once Titanic became a phenomenon, her life changed almost overnight. When Titanic arrived in theaters in December 1997, few people could have predicted just how enormous it would become. The movie captivated audiences with the relationship between Rose DeWitt Bukater and Jack Dawson, two young people from completely different worlds who meet aboard the doomed RMS Titanic. The film went on to earn more than $2 billion worldwide and became the highest-grossing movie in history at the time, remaining there for years before Avatar eventually took the crown. For Kate, however, the success was much more complicated than the numbers suggested. She had already built an impressive reputation through films like Sense and Sensibility and Hamlet, but Titanic transformed her from a respected young actress into a household name almost instantly. Suddenly, everyone knew her face. Everyone had an opinion about her, and privacy became something she could no longer take for granted. Years later, Winslet admitted that becoming famous so quickly had affected her deeply. Looking back on the experience, she described Titanic as something that had changed her life in both wonderful and difficult ways. She had been only 21 when the movie was made, and suddenly she found herself at the center of a level of public attention she had never experienced before. The media followed her appearance, her career, and virtually every part of her life, while tabloids became increasingly aggressive in the way they discussed her. What made the experience particularly painful was that much of the criticism focused on her appearance, rather than her talent. Kate has spoken openly about how frightening that period became for her, especially as a young woman trying to understand what it meant to live under such intense scrutiny. And for someone who had spent years fighting to prove that she belonged in acting, the sudden attention came with a very different kind of battle. Yet there was something else happening behind the scenes that makes her Titanic story even more remarkable. James Cameron had not immediately looked at Kate Winslet and thought, "That's Rose." In fact, when he began considering actresses for the role, he had other possibilities in mind, including Gwyneth Paltrow. Kate had already appeared in several period dramas, and Cameron worried that audiences might see her as the same kind of actress playing another historical character. He even joked that she had developed a reputation as Corset Kate because of the costumes and period settings surrounding many of her early roles. To Cameron, choosing her could have looked predictable. But Kate was determined to change his mind. She wanted the part badly, and eventually she got the chance to prove that she could bring something completely different to Rose. When Cameron finally met her, his doubts began to disappear. Kate impressed him enough that the director realized there was something in her that could work for the enormous role he had created. Rose was not supposed to be simply another romantic heroine. She needed to feel trapped by the world around her, frustrated by the future that had been chosen for her, and courageous enough to reach for something different. Kate brought that emotional intensity to the character, and Cameron eventually decided she was right for the part. But there was still one major piece of the puzzle missing. Rose could only work if the actor playing Jack could create a believable connection with her. And that brought Cameron to Leonardo DiCaprio, a young actor who was already becoming one of Hollywood's biggest names. What happened when DiCaprio first walked into Cameron's office, however, was almost enough to end the casting process before it began. According to Cameron, DiCaprio arrived expecting nothing more than a meeting with Kate. He had already established himself with acclaimed performances and had even received an Academy Award nomination for What's Eating Gilbert Grape, so he was no longer an unknown actor desperate for every audition. But Cameron had a different plan. He wanted to see the two potential leads actually perform together on camera because, for Titanic, chemistry was not something he could simply assume would appear once filming started. When Cameron told DiCaprio that they would run lines and film the scene, the actor reportedly pushed back, essentially asking whether he really had to read for the part. Cameron's response was blunt. He was not interested in wasting 2 years of his life on the wrong casting decision, and he made it clear that DiCaprio would either audition or walk away without the role. That moment could have ended everything, but DiCaprio agreed to read. And according to Cameron, the transformation happened almost immediately. Once the camera started rolling, the actor stopped behaving like someone who was simply auditioning for a job and became Jack Dawson. The director watched the change happen in front of him, and suddenly, the question was no longer whether Leonardo could play Jack. It was whether anyone else could. Then Kate and Leo performed together, and the chemistry Cameron had been searching for became obvious. It was not something that needed to be manufactured through editing or special effects. The connection was already there in the room. That screen test ultimately helped convince Cameron that he had found his two leads. And with that decision, one of the most famous acting partnerships in modern movie history was born. What audiences saw on screen in 1997 was therefore the result of several decisions that could easily have gone another way. Kate Winslet could have been passed over because Cameron thought her previous work made her too predictable. Leonardo DiCaprio could have refused the screen test and walked away before anyone ever saw him become Jack. Instead, both actors took the chance, and the result became a cultural phenomenon. They would go on to remain close friends long after the cameras stopped rolling, something that has only made the public fascination with their relationship even stronger. But their friendship also exists outside the fantasy that audiences created around Jack and Rose. Kate and Leonardo never needed to become a real-life couple to make their connection meaningful. What they created was something different, a professional partnership that survived fame, decades of public speculation, and the enormous shadow cast by the movie that brought them together. And perhaps that is what makes Kate Winslet's Titanic story so fascinating all these years later. The movie may have made her famous, but fame was never the whole story. Behind Rose was a young actress who had spent years working for opportunities, dealing with rejection, and proving that she could do far more than the industry initially expected from her. Then, almost overnight, the world decided it knew everything about her. Kate has since spoken about how difficult that period was, but she has also acknowledged what Titanic ultimately gave her: freedom, career choices, lifelong friendships, and the ability to build a remarkable career on her own terms. And when you look back at the chain of decisions that led to that movie, one thing becomes clear. The woman audiences eventually knew as Rose was never simply lucky to be there. She had been preparing for that moment long before the world was ready to remember her name. The brutal price of becoming Titanic stars. The success of Titanic was supposed to be the dream every young actor hoped for. But for Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, the reality waiting on the other side of that success was far more complicated. One moment, they were two young actors taking a chance on an enormous movie. And the next, strangers everywhere felt as though they knew them personally. The attention did not simply follow their work anymore. It followed their faces, their bodies, their private lives, and every decision they made. Kate was judged relentlessly for how she looked, while Leo was transformed into a global heartthrob almost overnight. What neither of them had expected was how quickly fame could turn admiration into entitlement, with people believing they had the right to pick apart two very young actors who were still trying to figure themselves out. For Kate, some of the harshest treatment came from the media itself. She has spoken about how uncomfortable she became with the constant intrusion after Titanic, saying she felt pressured to look a certain way and become a certain kind of celebrity. She was barely in her 20s, yet journalists and tabloids were already treating her appearance as something that could be publicly debated. Even her decision to pursue smaller films was questioned. People could not understand why someone who had just starred in the biggest movie in the world would deliberately step away from huge opportunities. But Kate knew exactly why she was doing it. She wanted to act without feeling as though every decision would become another headline. And she wanted a life where she could do something as ordinary as feeding ducks without wondering whether someone was watching. The body shaming followed her even after the movie had become a cultural landmark. The infamous debate about whether Jack and Rose could both fit on the floating wreckage somehow became an excuse for people to comment on Kate's body. Years later, she remembered the cruelty of those remarks and questioned why people had been so mean to her when she was simply a young woman growing up in public. What makes those memories especially painful is that Kate was not some established star who had decades of experience dealing with criticism. She was 21 when Titanic was filmed. She was still developing her confidence, still learning how the industry worked, and suddenly millions of people were telling her what was wrong with her appearance. Looking back, she has called that treatment bullying, and said the scrutiny was far beyond what a young person should have been expected to handle. And the pressure reached further than gossip columns. Kate has recalled that even people within the film industry could treat her weight as a professional concern, with her agent receiving calls asking how much she weighed. That detail says a lot about the environment she entered after Titanic. Her success should have been about her performances, yet conversations about her body could overshadow the actual work. She has since said that things are changing for young women in the industry, and she is grateful that performers now have more confidence to challenge treatment that earlier generations were expected to simply endure. Kate had to learn how to find that voice later, after already experiencing what happened when the public believed it had the right to define her. Leonardo DiCaprio faced a different kind of pressure, but it was just as capable of taking over his life. His face suddenly appeared on magazine covers everywhere, and the serious young actor he had been building became overshadowed by the image of a global heartthrob. DiCaprio later admitted that his entire life suddenly seemed to revolve around things that had nothing to do with acting. He had entered the industry with very specific ambitions, but Titanic created an entirely new expectation around him. Hollywood wanted him to remain the young romantic star audiences had fallen for, while fans wanted more of the image they had created in their heads. The problem was that Leonardo had no interest in allowing that image to determine his future. Instead of following the safest path, he used the power Titanic had given him to make riskier choices. He turned toward the kind of challenging films he had wanted to make before fame became overwhelming, choosing projects because they interested him rather than because they offered the biggest possible commercial reward. That instinct had actually been part of his career long before Titanic. As a teenager, he had even turned down a major opportunity in favor of a smaller role in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, because working with Robert De Niro mattered more to him. It was a gamble, especially when he badly needed money. But he believed that one meaningful performance could shape his future more than one easy paycheck. In the end, both stars found their own way of dealing with the storm that came after Titanic. Kate stepped away from the kind of fame that made her feel watched and judged, while Leo refused to let his heartthrob image dictate what kind of actor he would become. The public had turned them into two of the most recognizable young stars in the world, but the cruelty surrounding that fame taught them an important lesson very early. Being famous did not mean they owed everyone access to their lives. And perhaps that is why, decades later, both Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio still seem so determined to control the parts of themselves that the world does not get to own. At 50, Kate Winslet finally revealed her true feelings for Leo DiCaprio. For nearly 3 decades, fans have looked at Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio and wondered whether there was ever something more between them. After all, their connection seemed almost too natural to be completely platonic. They met as 2 young actors in their early 20s, became inseparable while filming Titanic, created one of the most convincing romances in movie history, and somehow remained incredibly close long after the cameras stopped rolling. Then there were the awards show moments, the emotional reunions, the way they spoke about each other, and the fact that they seemed to understand one another in a way few Hollywood friendships do. It was enough to keep the rumors alive for years, but Kate has never been particularly interested in feeding that fantasy. In fact, her explanation for why she and Leo never became a couple may be the biggest clue to what their relationship really was. When Kate and Leonardo first met on the set of Titanic, they were just 21 and 22 years old, 2 young actors who had no idea they were about to become international stars. Kate later described their first meeting as an instant connection, saying they simply clicked from the beginning. Instead of becoming awkward around each other because they were playing romantic leads, they quickly became comfortable enough to behave like children together. They joked around, teased each other, and constantly found ways to make one another laugh. Kate even recalled them behaving like goofy kids, with neither actor taking themselves particularly seriously between takes. That ease became an important part of their friendship, because behind the scenes, there was no mysterious tension building between them. There was simply 2 young people who had discovered they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. And Kate was certainly aware that Leonardo was attractive. She admitted that before meeting him, she had wondered whether she might be completely overwhelmed by him, or whether he might see her as too serious and traditional. Instead, the opposite happened. Their friendship became so comfortable that they could tease one another without worrying about how it looked. Kate recalled Leo tickling her and winding her up, while she would give it right back to him, even jokingly grabbing his backside. To outsiders, that kind of behavior could easily look flirtatious, especially when the 2 people involved were playing Hollywood's most famous young lovers. But to Kate, there was a very clear distinction between their playful friendship and genuine romantic attraction. They knew each other too well, and that familiarity changed everything. That is why Kate found the dating rumors so funny rather than exciting. While audiences were imagining that Jack and Rose's chemistry had somehow spilled into real life, the actors themselves apparently saw the whole idea very differently. Kate once explained that the thought of them actually dating seemed almost absurd to her, because their bond felt much more like family or friendship than romance. She even joked that a relationship between them would have felt like incest. It was an unusually blunt way of putting it, but it revealed something important. The chemistry audiences saw was real, but it belonged to the characters. Kate could completely surrender herself to Rose's feelings for Jack when the cameras were rolling, without confusing those emotions with what she personally felt for Leonardo. That distinction became especially obvious while filming the famous intimate scenes in Titanic. Kate admitted that there was a strange disconnect between what she was feeling as an actress and what she felt toward Leo as a person. When she played Rose, she could feel the character falling for Jack and respond to the chemistry of the scene completely. But once the camera stopped, she was still Kate, and Leo was still her best friend. She later explained that she could enjoy the feeling of Rose loving Jack without actually being in love with Leonardo. That ability to separate performance from reality probably helped make their scenes feel so convincing. They did not have to be secretly attracted to each other to create chemistry. They simply trusted each other enough to make the characters believable. More than a decade later, they tested that friendship in a completely different way when they reunited for Revolutionary Road. This time, there was no sinking ship or forbidden romance. They played Frank and April Wheeler, a married couple whose relationship was falling apart under the weight of disappointment and resentment. Their performances required them to explore much more complicated emotions, including intimate scenes that Kate admitted were awkward to film. The situation became even stranger because the director, Sam Mendes, was Kate's husband at the time. She reportedly kept telling Leo that the whole thing felt weird because he was her best friend, while the man directing the scene was her husband. Leo, according to Kate, simply told her to get over it. Somehow, their friendship survived even that unusual working arrangement. Then came one of the moments that probably gave the romance rumors fresh life all over again. At the 2009 Golden Globes, Kate won awards for both Revolutionary Road and The Reader. And during her emotional acceptance speech, the camera caught Leonardo watching her with enormous affection and pride. As he blew kisses toward her from the audience, Kate looked over at him and told him how happy she was to stand there and say how much she loved him, and how much she had loved him for 13 years. To anyone unfamiliar with their friendship, it could have sounded like a confession. But Kate was talking about a bond that had grown since the moment they first met, not a secret romance. Their affection for one another was genuine. It simply never needed to become romantic to be profound. That same trust eventually followed them into their lives outside Hollywood. When Kate married Ned Rock'n'Roll in 2012, Leonardo was reportedly the person who walked her down the aisle during the private ceremony. Years later, when DiCaprio finally won his long-awaited Academy Award for The Revenant in 2016, Kate's reaction said almost everything. She watched her friend finally receive the recognition he had waited years for, and the pride on her face was unmistakable. By then, their friendship had survived fame, rumors, marriages, careers, and nearly 2 decades of public fascination. And perhaps that is exactly why it lasted. There was never a relationship to fall apart, no secret romance that eventually became complicated, and no breakup that could destroy what they had built. Kate eventually explained the secret herself. She said the reason their friendship worked was precisely because there had never been a romantic element between them. She acknowledged that it might disappoint people who wanted the real-life version of the Titanic love story, but the truth was far less dramatic and, in many ways, much more meaningful. Leo saw her as one of the boys, she said, and she never considered herself particularly girly. Leonardo has described Kate in similarly affectionate terms, calling her one of his dearest friends and emphasizing the ultimate trust they share. And after all these years, that may be the real story hiding underneath all those romance rumors. Kate Winslet never needed to fall in love with Leonardo DiCaprio to love him deeply. Their bond survived precisely because it was never built on the fantasy everyone else wanted to believe. Were you a fan of Titanic? And what was your favorite moment from the film? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.